okay for you to have the questions, the session of questions and answers after Mr. Gagnon, because he has something and have to leave after his presentation. It's okay for you?
That is all right. Yes,
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So we'll pass to Mr. Gagnon.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, a short presentation. I have the pleasure to present Phillipe Gagnon. He's presented as principal researcher of the plant sciences, technosciences at Foire à l'œuvre de l'écologie intégrale. Sorry for my pronunciation in French. À Lille Catholic University, researcher at Ethics Laboratory, and lecturer at the Faculté de Théologie. He has taught philosophy, biology, and mathematics in his native Canada, and then in the United States. He holds a doctorate of philosophy, Université Laval 2005, and in theology, Dominican College of Philosophy and Theology, Ottawa 2000. Mr. Gagnon will present us the paper with the title Transhumanism as a Glimpse in the Beyond, a case for its ontology and narrative substitution. Thank you, Mr. Gagnon, please.
Yes, first off, I apologize. I did not realize there was a time zone difference involved. And it's very gracious of you to have asked Professor Knight to speak first and to arrange things, so to speak. So let's get going. I would say upon first inspection, the salvation within a transhumanist perspective is only technological. It seems that they have for option nothing other than the extension or the stretching in an indefinite way of our life as we know it. And herein lies a certain paradox, because what is dreamed of is a life without weakness, interaction, contingencies, and quite simply human frailty. Yet this is not a condition we've known as such. It is a condition that we extract from reality and where we feel comfortable and that we deem desirable. If what is extended is savable, quote unquote, on a different support, it is by the same token not mine. It is, I would say, multiply realizable in the sense of the thesis of Hilary Putnam in Philosophy of Science. The highly individualized history of a nervous system, the encounters that have made it what it is, are for large part epigenetic and would not have obtained without the inscription in the body. So herein, therefore, comes another paradox, since many have criticized transhumanism for inventing a salvation that's in fact an extraction from my embodiment, and that only concerns the ego. It's me saving myself and extending a happiness of detachment, which is autarkic, self-referenced, and not in need of anything from anyone. We can only fail to grasp our core content if we want for it, quote unquote, whatever that turns out being, to be extractable as an informational signature. What is deictic? In other words, what points to concrete and to lived out experiences, Erlebnissen, we'd say in German, is contained as, at best, in redundancy from this perspective. It is not in any surprise-producing signal, nor can it become Shannon's entropy function labeled H. And this is something I delved into in my recent ESAT paper. ESAT took place in Norway not long ago. So all the properties that would be thus safe belong to not individuals, but individuals, if you suppress the in. And so, in this sense, the text of Bill Joy, that's one of the foundational ones for transhumanism, the future does not need us, does not seem to see this point. Its fear is that a new eugenism would prevail with the complete resorption of ourselves. The way I just described is an even graver matter. So the salvation of the transhumanist is not a salvation toward, it is a being saved from. And in this, the body is seen as an obstacle, and death is seen as an obstacle. Now, another point that we need to make is that I remember hearing an impressive interview and then reading a text that kind of put it on paper from Albert Jacob, who was a French population geneticist and popular science writer. And he was an agnostic. And he said he could not make any sense of our experience in its current form as a simple perjuration. Indeed, from his perspective of population genetics, from that viewpoint, it was simply bypassed and lightly bypassed in a vision like this. So there seems to be some important questions to ponder upon. For instance, would it not be more logical to propound a dissolution of everything in everything under the guise of a flame, as was done by Pierre Lévy? I cite the English translation of this book, Becoming Virtual, in the English title. The contemporary body resembles a flame. It entwines itself with the public body and burns with the same heat, shines with the same light as other body flames. End of quote. And so in this case, at least, we would be clearly in the context of cosmological and even anthropological monocytism, a mind that's one for all, but also, as in the writings of Luciano Floridi, one of the information philosophers, a body, also not a mind, but a body that's one for all, that is informational, and as such, which has no fleshly referent, if you want. But then why put everything under mind if we are in a materialistic vision? And indeed, if Averroes or Ibn Rushd from Cordoba pulled toward a one soul for all model, which I already referred to, it is that at first he admitted Aristotle's rational psychology. Now, if we were to delve into this, and the time allotted here is not very long, but if we were to, we would find that cognitive science and AI have tried to grasp man as part of nature, and when they speak of cognition rather than knowledge, it's not innocent. It is precisely that they want to avoid flights into spiritualist connotations that are almost inseparable from a word like knowledge. So we have thus a sort of desideratum of a naturalistic explanation of this cognition, and it will be done with a focus on the relationship between an organism that falls under the knowledge of biology and an environment that falls under the knowledge of physics. And what we can observe is that the adoption of the computationalist paradigm inserts right away in this naturalistic orientation a model of thought as logical and as a calculus, which is much older than this naturalist reduction, and largely, and that's the paradox, independent of it. In other words, the tools that the computo-representationalist paradigm has given itself are first our logic, predicate logic, as well as the theory of calculability. And one can only find that these elements are rigidly tied to mathematical thought in its process of self-elucidation between Hilbert and Turing. So those tools resemble the contemporary formal expression of a very old and deep conception of reason that would see in mathematics the greatest accomplishments for such a reason. Now, if I now call on to a theme that for Orthodox in particular would be particularly central, that of the image of God, and I'm very historically in my own thought very tied to a lot of Orthodox thinkers. You know, I'm Roman Catholic, as you all can see and appreciate. So the image of God in us, I would say, cannot be destroyed. And this is what's at stake, it seems to me. If I look at European culture in general, I recall the Surrealist movement, for instance. One could already see in L'Autre Amont in his Chant de Mal published posthumously but rediscovered by the Surrealists, because he died at 24. He was performing the most immoral and criminal acts he could think of, like it's imaginary, it's oniric, we would say in French, it's dream-like, but he put his fingers into the flesh of the baby and just rip apart the blood. And then he would be claiming that he would, at least in this way, keep affirming creation with all its horrific contents and put it in the face of the Creator, somehow to punish him and to revolt him. And the posture is almost to instill in God regret over having created us. And I would also call in what I call the Great Lamarckian Project. And I don't find that in much literature about transhumanism, because we don't go into the assumptions enough. At the heart of some strands of Western or European efforts to affirm human dignity in front of the cosmos that Hegel once captured as supremely indifferent to our fate. He was looking at the Alps and he says, as is so, it just is. And it has no regard for the short duration of our lives. What I would call the metaphysics of the Oceanic sentiment, which is an expression for Romain Rolland. So, in front of such a cosmos that seems to be supremely indifferent to our fate, is the idea that our efforts, even though they would be overwhelmingly surpassed by the massive resisting forces of the universe, still would matter. And this does not bode well with a simple affirmation of human mortality. On the contrary, one will find efforts at directing the course of things with the mind, or perceiving, controlling correlations. It's a very interesting expression of Ilya Prigozhin in La Nouvelle Alliance. The English is order out of chaos. And the page is 285 for those who could look at the reference, but he says, if we don't control correlations, we can expect in science to control collisions. In other words, through knowing synchronicities, one would edge one's bet on the side of mind against matter. And you have these books by Carl Gustav Jung on synchronicity, coincidence, and even Wolfgang Pauli, the great physicist. And then you'd have to also factor in examples such as Paul Kemmerer with his midwife Toad, about which Arthur Koestler wrote an interesting book, The Case of Midwife Toad, or even Trofim Lysenko, with his Lamarckian inducement of stress on plants and organisms because they can, by their own effort, overcome it and become stronger. All of this is not generally adduced to transhumanist proposals, but nevertheless, it paves the way for secular salvation of man. And you have a letter of Freud to Grodek, where he claims directly that his work is to be inscribed in this great Lamarckian tradition. And so, I have called it a theological referment. The Word creates us in the image of God and the Spirit to the resemblance. At least that's Irenaeus' two names of the Father, an important tradition for me and for Thierry Magnin, with whom I work and live now, but we used to work together in Lyon. And the image cannot be lost, as I said, but resemblance becomes the great project. Now, to counter what I said, you have one option out there, and it would be to destroy man. Get rid of his humanity as we know. And then the question would be, would you then destroy the image? Now, alluding back to Bill Joy in the future does not need us, a text that originally was published in Wired. It's striking that any notion of a communion and salvation seems indeed to be destroyed. One can see it by consulting those founding texts. It's an emblem of this movement, and right away the problem we're led into is, as I said, that of the selection of the elite was going to be augmented and transformed beyond humanity. Joy cites in a very striking way Theodore Kaczynski. And the quote is quite dramatic. Kaczynski is the Unabomber, for those who know U.S. criminal history. shall I name it? And so, in a striking and dramatic quote that's recycled by great Kurzweil in The Age of Spiritual Machines, the idea is we're losing to the machines by having let them manage too much. They're sort of intertwined with us, so now we will need to create an elite to regain control. And here I hark back to what I said before. It's a salvation for myself or for this totalized collective elite. But it was interesting to hear Father Knight's comments about the desire to study the transhumanist proposals case by case, and I would agree. And so if one looks at, in my tradition, Roman Catholic, at the modernist crisis and the way of Vatican II, one thing is striking is that thinkers such as Blondel, Leroy, and others that were indeed suspected of modernism, they had seen how we were misled by a form of apologetics that claimed it could convert by simple deductions from premises dropped from the hat, or by traces of God simply discoverable from cosmological and moral experience. And in Christian circles, in particular in neo-scholastic trends, religious philosophy of a realistic bent failed to emphasize that what we believe is what ought to be. And we are not modeling ourselves simply on what is. Among all these names, I mentioned a couple, Blondel, Leroy, but there's a plethora. But I called him Father Auguste Valentin, who corresponded directly with Maurice Blondel, and had his life somehow transformed when he read Blondel's L'action. And he wrote that if I knew the truth of Jesus Christ in another way than faith, my faith would not have to make of it its objects. In other words, he was defending the will part of the act of faith, and he wrote something that I quite marveled the first time I heard it. And I translated it for you in English. If, he says, if per impossibile, at my deathbed, it would be manifested to me with perfect evidence that I erred, that there is no survival, that there is even no God, I would not regret to have believed it. I would even think that I honored myself in believing it, and that if the universe is something idiotic and contemptible, it is too bad for it. And that the blame ought not to be in me for having thought that God is, but in God for not being. And one wonders if we don't have here a version of the ontological argument applied to self. In other words, one could make a simple case for the preservation of consciousness. For instance, you could say, okay, I can conceive of the organic machinery of my body. I taught biology, I know enough to appreciate this. So the organic machinery of my body is starting to have mishaps, making errors of copying, breaking down. But what is not conceivable is one annihilation, the very moment one thinks of one's perpetuation. Our consciousness requires to exist. Now, in the ontological argument classically understood, perfection, the greatest perfection, would have been idea plus existence and reality. It's not just the greatest idea I can conceive. And Ganilo's objection was quite ridiculous, I think, when everything is considered. It's that the greatest idea precisely ought to exist, because otherwise there would be a greater one that would also be what I'm thinking and would exist. Of course, what's missing between the two renditions that I'm trying to build here, the preservation, the required preservation of consciousness of that same insight that coincide, is that in the one case we have perfection predicated on anything existing. Well, what is it to exist? Where would we find it other than in existence? So against Quine's dictum, to be is to be the value of the bound variable, one would have to assert with William Vallicella, among others, that existence itself exists, what Vallicella calls the thick theory of existence as opposed to the thin one. So if we recapitulate, I pointed, right, to a few things that seems to be from the viewpoint, for instance, of population genetics, rather lightly appreciated by transhumanist proposals. Now, if you go and you read, again, another foundational text that's not all that long from Max More, or Letter to Mother Nature, what you see is that the process that is pictured as being evolutionary requires apparently a next step. And the author says perhaps, and that's to be appreciated, and the next step that would be honest to achieve. Like is amendment number 5, after a short text, there's a bunch of amendments, I think there's 9 of them. We will fix individual and species defects left by natural selection. Now this is quite interesting because I had recently in Vendée in France in a conference to speak about chance and evolution, and this is a chance fairy version of a reconstrual of Darwin's work, as is so common, because Darwin upheld a Laplacian determinism. And so we would fix errors made by natural selection, which is quite an interesting affirmation, after we've also read from the author that there is distributed intelligence, whatever that means, in the process of evolutionary becoming. So each will decide how long they will live. We will increase our perceptual abilities. And then we see in number 6, amendment number 6, we will remove emotional barriers to rational self-direction. In other words, there's too much emotion messing, right, with our minds. But where does this mind concept, this reason concept even come from? It seems to be assumed, right? And I think that the remarks I made about the AI and cognitivist project paradigm earlier would have to be called in here. So we come against a problem that is far from new if we look at it from the perspective of philosophy of religion. The problem is said to be the problem of evil in a lot of textbooks. And it's the clincher, apparently, that has terminated the fate of so many people honestly undergoing an inquiry into the faith. Now, if we are to address this seriously and thoroughly, we need to get rid of anthropomorphic images of God. The fact of the matter is that, as Aquinas makes plain in his Summa Theologiae, in the Prima Pas, question 15, Article 3 at Primum, we read this. And he's asking what are the ideas that are in God. And he says, et ideo malum non habet in Deo ideam. In other words, God has no idea of evil. So, therefore, to claim that one can revert to horrendous evils, I borrow the terminology from Marilyn McCord Adams, revert those onto God, slapping back with them, and to embarrass God himself, must be denied, since God could only be said to bear them and suffer with us. It would rather be the opposite, in front of them, something in which Alfred North Whitehead had a keen insight, as some of you may know. It's one part of my work to study the philosophy of Whitehead here in Lille. So to claim that nature is ill-conceived, as we saw in Letter to Mother Nature, seems to me a tricky wicked. Since the trillion cells that are even mentioned by Max More in his text, of about 250 types, some of which perform every second thousands of operations, that is not accounted for. It's simply, thrown into the initial conditions, so to speak. But it seems to me that this comes from people used to working on computer programs, and they clearly here underestimate the complexity of our biology. That there is never a sense of just looking at what there is and marveling at it, because the only concept of reason is what you would call in French l'entendement. It's deductive, logical reason, but this has to be put against another understanding. So if God does not calculate like us, if God has no idea of evil, of deceit, of trickery, it's possible to widen the scope of the problem and to see just how there is a sort of, thou seest me always, Father Lugado's famous prayer, that is used incorrectly to claim a competition between the freedom of man and that of God. And a God who seeks to promote, to make free, does not and cannot lay traps on the way of man to show his superiority on requiring obedience. I think Father Schleman fabulous text about this, where he says if you take this premise, you can only end up, he did speak of transhumanism at the time, it was written in the 60s, but you can only end up with problems such as we have on our hands now. So finally, to validate what I said earlier, I do not think that the transhumanism is to be attacked, denied, dismantled without first looking at the assumptions that have gone into it. And as a final example, because my time is drawn to an end, I will just state this example. I worked on a French philosopher and theologian. Matter of fact, there's a book of proceedings of a study day in Lyon that will be coming out soon that I'm editing. But Thérèse Montan, in France, they had to do it in the Times, a large dissertation and a small one. So for a small dissertation, he edited the correspondence of two fabulous Catholic metaphysicians, Lucien Bertoniac and Maurice Blondel. And what's striking is that these friends, because they were both suspected of modernism, and so they held together and encouraged each other, these friends ended up parting ways on an issue where Le Bertoniac thought that the images of God, of a God, who makes us suffer for redemption, were unworthy of a God who, in his understanding, on the contrary, being true love, would not do anything that put his beloved even before. He would put the beloved even before himself. Never would he humiliate or constrain or, impose his will in a violent way. And to this, Blondel objected that it is an anthropomorphic and almost Fichtean moralization of the problem. That in God, because the God is greater than us, and because what awaits us cannot be intuited in any other way than through what he called a démonachie, a dispossession of any image and analogy, and an obedience of the faith walking in the night, we have to simply trust that the transformation, the metamorphosis, as in Paul's language, expected of us cannot be grasped entirely. And I find, these will be my concluding words, I find that one could put these debates side by side with the assumptions that go into transhumanist reasoning, and find that indeed it is a challenge for us to simply, through faith, the theological virtue of faith, trust that God has made us corporeal, embodied beings for a profound reason. And I think that if I had more time, I could develop the Neoplatonic understanding within Christian tradition. But I think that every objection we make to the transhumanist proposals, when we look back at our own debates, we can see traces of what could lead there. And I think that we need to have an attitude of openness and try to listen to what it means for us when we utter judgments on such a project. Thanks for listening.